Hi, Joseph.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good to
Good.
be with you.
Good to have you. Thanks for joining us. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Joseph Goldstein, very well-known teacher, thinker, and writer about Buddhism, very well-known in American Buddhist circles, and I would say actually a kind of significant figure in the history of American Buddhism, in that when you founded the Insight Meditation Society in the early 70s along with Sharon Salzberg and Jack Kornfield, you played an important role in bringing a particular kind of Buddhist meditative practice into America, what's called Vipassana, and we'll get into that. And now you've got a book out that we want to talk about, and I've been reading the Kindle version, so I'm afraid I can't show the cover in its full glory, but here's what it looks like on a smartphone. It's called Mindfulness, a Practical Guide to Awakening. Now, mindfulness and awakening are both very important words in Buddhism, of course. And mindfulness, and I want to talk about both of them, mindfulness has recently infiltrated non-Buddhist circles. You hear it in a lot of places. I've heard evangelical pastors talk about mindfulness. And there's a lot of kind of purely what you might call secular discussion of it. So for starters, is it easy to tell us what the word means?
Well, it has a nuance of meaning. And, it's a bit like asking what is art or what is love. It's very hard in a few words to describe the various aspects.
I'm hoping you'll cover those as well before we get through the book. Let's start with mindfulness.
We'll get it all in.
Yeah.
So let me just give you a few dimensions of what mindfulness means and also what it doesn't mean. Very often people refer to mindfulness, or they describe the meaning of living in the present moment. And when you're mindful, you're in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But although it's necessary, it's really not sufficient to describe what mindfulness is, because there's a kind of mind that I call black lab consciousness. And I know most people are familiar with black labs.
I have dogs.
Very playful dogs, a joy to watch. When we're watching them, they're very much in the present moment. They're right there with what they're doing, but they don't look very mindful. And so mindfulness has to mean something more than simply being in the present moment. But that's the starting place, right? So we connect with what's happening.
Okay.
In addition to that, there needs to be a kind of observing power of the mind, so we know what the present moment is. It's kind of meta to the moment, M-E-T-A, right? And so when we're seeing or smelling or thinking or feeling, we actually are aware that these things are happening.
Okay.
So that's a further dimension of mindfulness. There's one more dimension that's critical, that's often left out in the popular discussion of mindfulness, and it actually ties into the meaning of awakening. And that is the ethical dimension of mindfulness. And this is not really mentioned very often, which means that we can be observing something. We're in the moment, we're observing it. But the question is, what's the filter in the mind through which we're observing it? Is it greed? Is it aversion? Is it love? Is it compassion? When mindfulness is present, the mind is always wholesome. So if we're observing, we're in the present and we're observing, but it's through the filter of greed or ill will. So then even though we're observing it, that's not being mindful.
Okay.
So this ethical dimension is a really important aspect.
Okay, and you often hear mindfulness in conjunction with the word meditation, to designate a type of meditation, and that's really a lot of what your book is about. And I should say your book is based on a famous discourse of the Buddha, which is the
Satipatthana
Sutta or Sutra, depending on which ancient language you speak, which is often translated as the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. So this is considered a fundamental text for mindfulness generally, but mindfulness meditation in particular. And your book is an exposition of that discourse and an analysis of it. So as it applies to meditation, What is it particularly associated with Vipassana, which, as I said, is the meditation tradition that you're associated with?
Yes, Vipassana, which comes, the literal meaning comes from the Pali language, Vipassana, the ancient language that the Buddha supposedly taught in. Mm-hmm. The literal meaning of Vipassana is to see things clearly. And so there are many techniques of Vipassana which cultivate this ability to see things clearly. The basis for all of them is mindfulness. Mm-hmm. It's this quality of mind, that is in the present, that's observing what's happening without the filter of greed or hatred or delusion. And the Satipatthana Sutta, that discourse on the foundation of mindfulness, outlines many different techniques or methods for cultivating mindfulness. So it's a very rich discourse, many aspects to it.
Okay.
And it is the basis of all the traditions of insight meditation of Vipassana.
Uh-huh. Okay. And we will get to meditation very shortly. First, I promised to interrogate you a little further about the word in your subtitle, awakening, which is a very important word in Buddhism, of course. What is you're calling this a practical guide to awakening. What do you mean by awakening in this context?
Well, awakening, there's a whole spectrum of awakening, starting with the difference between being lost in our thoughts and being carried away by our thoughts, and then awakening to the fact that we're thinking. Mm-hmm. So that's a very simple, right in the moment kind of awakening. On the other end of the spectrum, awakening really means enlightenment. And in the Buddhist context, the most pragmatic description of enlightenment is that mind which is free of greed, free of hatred, free of ignorance. Those forces have been uprooted from the mind. And that's the goal, really, of mindfulness practice.
That's one end of the spectrum. That's like touchdown.
That's the final goal.
Yeah, that's like, and is that essentially synonymous with nirvana? Have you attained nirvana if
Yes.
you've reached true enlightenment?
Yes.
You have.
The Buddha, in some of the texts, describes nirvana as the uprooting of greed and hatred and ignorance. Mm-hmm. That's no easy task.
It's not.
But there is a path to it.
Right. And in fact, just to give a sense of its ambition, isn't it the case that you could define greed and hatred more, you could translate them more broadly than those two words suggest, right? We're not just talking about don't be greedy in the sense of money, and we're not just talking about don't hate individual people, right? I mean,
correct.
The original, the Pali words could be translated as broadly as almost as attraction and aversion, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. The words cover a wide spectrum of mind states. And so greed really refers to, as you say, attraction or clinging or a kind of addictive wanting. Mm-hmm. And hatred is aversion, is ill will, is fear, is irritation, is annoyance. So it doesn't have to be the full-blown experience of hatred. It can be all the minor feelings of aversion or ill will that we might feel just in the course of the day.
Right. But if you truly are enlightened in the extreme sense of the term,
these would not arise.
These things would not arise. Hard to imagine life without them. People who say they've attained this state say it's a very nice place to be, and the Buddha himself emphasized that there's a version of happiness you wind up with that he would rate more highly than the other happiness. It's not like you're devoid of feeling.
Exactly. And the Buddha talked about 7 different kinds of happiness. So we could really see the whole path as developing deeper and deeper feelings of happiness all along the way, because we're letting go or weakening the forces in our mind which cause us to suffer and cause other people to suffer.
Okay, so even if you never achieve full enlightenment, which I think it's safe to say about me, there's a whole spectrum of outcomes.
Yes,
between
positive
here and there,
all along the way.
Many of which would be better than your life is now, right? I mean, that's you would hold that view at least about the average person's life.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I want to jump quickly to I got to say this book it covers the waterfront, because the discourse it's about, the Buddhist discourse it's about, does cover the waterfront. Winds up getting into the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and so on. So you can learn about all fundamental aspects of Buddhism by reading your book, and I want to cover as much of that as possible. I want to jump to something at the outset, because I think people may be able to latch on to this. One of the foundations of mindfulness involves being mindful of feelings. That doesn't necessarily mean to cover all the emotions. Feelings is defined in a way more narrowly, but the emotions are covered in another of the foundations of mindfulness. So one thing the Buddha talks about here, and you talk about, is being mindful of feelings. So can you try to give us some sense of, take emotions like, guilt, anxiety, remorse, hatred. When you are immersed in mindfulness meditation, what is the difference in the way you would relate to those feelings compared to the way I might go about it in my ordinary life when I'm in the grips of those feelings?
Okay, first, just to emphasize the distinction you made in the beginning of the Buddhist use of the word feeling,
right,
which refers to something a little different than the emotions which you're just describing. So just to clarify that for a moment.
Sure.
Feeling in the particular Buddhist sense refers to the quality in experience of it being pleasant or unpleasant or neutral.
Right.
So it is a more narrowly defined definition of the word feeling.
Right.
But now we'll be talking more about what we might more commonly call emotions.
And you might say that emotions are kind of elaborated forms of feelings, or at least that feelings are at their root in the sense that, anxiety is a kind of negative feeling. It's right. And lust is, well, maybe you wouldn't say this, I don't know, but I would say lust is a kind of positive feeling, right? Not in the sense of good.
I think just confusing two different meanings. Because this first meaning of feeling is simply how we taste, so to speak, each experience, whether it's an emotion or a physical sensation or a sight or a sound.
Okay.
We taste them in the moment. We feel them as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then there is the object experience, and that could be the emotion itself. It could be lust, it could be anger, it could be joy. So each one of them will feel as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. The key element of that is that pleasantness, when we're not mindful of it, generally conditions grasping. We like it. We want it. We want it to continue.
Right.
The unpleasant feeling conditions aversion. We don't like. We want to get rid of something unpleasant. And so the Buddha gives so much importance to this so that we can become mindful of things being pleasant, of things being unpleasant, without that reactivity. And that's what brings a great peace of mind, a great ease of mind. But then there's the question you bring up of how we experience different emotions,
right,
like sadness or fear or grief or happiness, or whatever the emotion may be. And that's a very big part of the meditation practice.
And can you talk a little about, from a subjective point of view? I mean, you've been there. You've done a lot of meditating. Can you try to describe to people who haven't done maybe any meditating how different the experience can be of relating to, say, fear or sadness or guilt or whatever?
Yeah. Yes, this is a very big part of meditation practice. And so I'll just give you an example from my own practice. For many years, and this goes back quite a way now, but I spent many years really working with the emotion of fear. That was like the primal, we could say, negative emotion that was arising.
And it was your big issue.
Right, exactly, my big issue. So the fear was coming up, and it wasn't particularly related to any specific situation. It was more just some primal conditioning that was arising in the meditation. I could feel it. And fear is quite unpleasant. We don't like it. So at first, a few different things happened. At first, I would be totally lost in some story I was making up about the fear, about myself. And I would be thinking, oh, I'm such a fearful person. This is going to take years to unwind. I was building a whole superstructure of self on top of the fear. So it took a while for me to actually see that I was doing that. Then there was a process of really recognizing and investigating the nature of fear. So I would be feeling these sensations in the body and the certain different qualities in the mind, and it would be as if I were saying, oh, fear is like this, right? So I was bringing that mindful investigation to the experience rather than getting lost in the story about it. But then even then, I still felt caught by it. I was still quite lost in it. And it took me quite a while to realize that even though I thought I was being mindful and I thought I was investigating, it was all with an attitude or a wish for it to go away. So I was actually observing it with aversion, even though I thought I was being mindful. And that points out a really critical difference between recognition and mindfulness. We can recognize something and still be wanting it to go away. So that's not yet mindfulness.
And it doesn't liberate you from it.
Exactly. Just the opposite, in fact. It further binds us to it. The more we resist something, the more it feeds it. And so the real turning point, and this took some time, was when I could be with the fear and investigate it. And the moment of acceptance came when I realized this fear can be here for the rest of my life. It's okay. And so it's okay became my mantra of acceptance. And it was amazing. As soon as my mind actually relaxed into that level of acceptance, that whole mass of fear washed through. It was amazing. It happened in that very moment.
Did it disappear immediately, or were you kind of observing it and yet observing it just in a purely objective way?
In that moment, it actually released. It actually disappeared. But it doesn't mean that fear never arose again. But from understanding that relationship of acceptance to it, then as it arose again, I was able to be with it and observe it in a much more relaxed way. And I would remind myself, it's okay. It's okay to feel this. And that's what gives the ease. That's what gives the spaciousness.
Okay. And when you say being with it and observing it, that's kind of the opposite of what our instinct is, right? I mean, fear is something we want to get away from. And you're saying that in meditation, you would focus on it.
Exactly. This goes against our conditioning, because fear, like many other experiences, whether pain in the body or other painful emotions, we do want to get away from. And so this is really the practice of mindfulness, of changing that conditioning so that instead of running away, we relax. And relaxation is an important part of meditation. Relaxing and opening into the emotion or whatever the experience is. And in that, we stop being afraid of the fear or afraid of whatever the other emotion might be. So there's a tremendous vibrancy there.
Okay. That leads to a kind of a question I have. I mean, this whole discussion of aversion. The first noble truth, the Four Noble Truths are thought of as the fundamental, exposition of Buddhism, and I guess it's the second or the third. One of them identifies the cause of suffering as fundamentally craving or thirst, trying to hang on to things that are not permanent, trying to hang on to pleasure that is going to evaporate, and so on. And it's put strictly in the Four Noble Truths per se in terms of this grasping attraction, this thirst, this craving. And yet, it seems to me that aversion the opposite is as much of a problem, and elsewhere in Buddhist scripture is emphasized as much. It's often put on par with attraction, right?
Yes.
With the thirsting.
Yes.
It just seems curious to me that aversion's not mentioned in the Four Noble Truths.
Well, I think that really implicit in the second of these truths, that craving is the cause of this unsatisfactoriness. I think implied in that is aversion. Aversion is really wanting something other than what we have. So it's really the flip. Aversion is the flip side of craving and always embedded in it.
So you're averse to non-pleasure. I mean,
yeah, we're averse to things that are painful,
right?
And wanting, craving the pleasant.
Yeah. So you crave, or the way I should have said is you crave non-anxiety, you crave non-fear. And I mean, it's also true, and this is a little different, I guess, but that fear is often derives from a fear of losing something you want to hang on to.
Yes, very often I think that's the case, and that's why the wisdom of meditation, and this takes repeated seeing the changing nature of every element of our experience, in our bodies, in our minds, in our emotions, in our environment, in our relationships. When we open our eyes, we can see really clearly that things are literally changing moment to moment. Mm-hmm. It's so obvious that we overlook it. And it becomes really clear that if we're holding on or wanting something to stay a certain way, if its nature is to change, then we're going to struggle when it does change. Mm-hmm. And so it's much more easeful to open to the truth of change, without grasping, without holding on, but still connected to the moment's experience.
Right. Now, I'm actually craving some water, and since I'm not as good a Buddhist as you are, I'm actually going to get it. Okay. Now I've got it. Let me ask you about what
now,
you get.
First, you have to take a drink of it to satisfy that craving.
And then I will only want more. I want more already.
Yes.
I see what he meant. On that subject of impermanence, this is, of course, a huge theme of the Buddhist worldview. Everything is impermanent. You have to accept that. Does that become vivid in the course of meditation, or can it become vivid in the course of mindfulness meditation? I mean, do you become more convinced of it? And if so, can you describe that to us?
Yeah, it very much becomes extremely vivid in meditation practice because we're practicing being undistracted. Mm-hmm. So as we're undistracted and just connected more to the flow of our changing experience, we see over and over again that things are arising and passing away. So I'll just give you a couple of examples, very simple examples. At the end of a formal meditation sitting, we might ring the bell. Mm-hmm. And so if you just ask somebody what just happened, oh, I heard the sound of the bell. As if the sound of the bell, at the end of the sitting is one thing. But if we're really being mindful as we're hearing the bell, mm-hmm. we see that for however long the sound lasts, maybe 15 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds, within that time, there is constant change going on. It's kind of nuances of sound and of vibration, intensity, pitch. So many different things are happening within what we would call the sound of a bell. And so we're really seeing the changing nature on a much more refined level. Mm-hmm. And the same thing happens with a familiar meditation object, for example, like the breath. Normally with, take an in-breath, take an out-breath, as if each of them is a single unit. But when we're really being mindful, we see that even within an in-breath, there are hundreds of sensations that are happening. And the quieter we get, we tune in, we refine our perception. It's something I call NPMs, noticings per minute. And in the beginning, our NPMs are pretty low, maybe 10 or 20. But as we cultivate awareness, mindfulness, the NPMs go way up. And we see within a breath or within a step, so many different changing sensations happening. And we also see the changing nature in our minds, the rapidity of thoughts arising and passing.
Mm-hmm. And does that actually help? I mean, to take an extreme case of having to come to grips with something in life and maybe being helped by a Buddhist perspective, let's say you lose a loved one. Does acceptance of impermanence actually help in a case like that? I mean, it seems a long way from listening to a bell and realizing that it's kind of infinitely divisible and there's no one essence of bell that endures forever, and, grieving over or not grieving over the loss of a relative.
Right. I think that for most people, the sadness and the grief is a natural part of the process. And so I think for most people, those are the emotions that are going to come because there's a loss involved. Mm-hmm. However, the degree to which we understand that this impermanence, the changing nature, is nature. It's not an aberration. This is the way nature is. Mm-hmm. And the Buddha expressed it very often and clearly said, everything which has the nature to arise, to be born, will also pass away. So this is just how things are. It's not unique to ourselves, and so the more we have internalized this understanding, we're able to put the loss into a more natural context. Okay. And so I think it gives us more balance with the emotions we may be feeling. And we're not so totally caught up or identified with them.
And then there is, I guess, the somewhat separate fact that sadness itself is something you can meditate on and change your relationship to.
Absolutely. We can be aware of sadness. We can be mindful of grief itself. And so the meditative discipline, we might say, is learning how to open to these emotions without being totally identified with them. Mm-hmm. And so it gives space. It creates a space in the heart and space in the mind for the emotions to arise and pass through.
Okay. Now let's do back up a little and give the broad outlines of the Satipatthana Sutta. The four foundations of mindfulness. It's basically the Buddha telling you how to be mindful. To a large extent, I guess, in a meditative context, of these four things. We talked about one of them, feelings in the narrow sense in which you described. Another one is the body.
Yes.
Another one is the mind. And then another one is, maybe the trickiest, is the dhammas or dharmas in Sanskrit. That's a word people have heard probably with a slightly different connotation than it'll have here. What do you want to talk about? Some of that we've talked a little about feelings. You want to talk about any of those other things?
Yeah, it is a really important discourse because it lays out in this very comprehensive way all the fields of mindfulness, all the ways we can establish mindfulness, and it starts with mindfulness of the body because in some way that's the most accessible. It's very apparent. It's not some esoteric object that we have to go searching for. It's immediately available to us. And in that section, the Buddha outlines a number of different ways we can be mindful of the body. And he starts with mindfulness of breathing. We're always breathing. If we're alive, we're breathing. And so it's not something we have to manufacture. It's something we can always come back to. What's helpful in this regard is to realize that it's not a breathing exercise. So we're not trying to breathe in a particular way. It's an exercise in mindfulness. Mm-hmm. And so we're just with the natural breath, however it's showing itself, and we're mindful of it. We're aware of it. As we breathe in, we know we're breathing in. As we breathe out, we know we're breathing out. So it's that simple. Mm-hmm. So
not easy though.
Exactly.
As I know from personal experience.
Yes.
Not easy to stay. Anyone who hasn't meditated should now close their eyes and just try to count 10 breaths and see if they succeed in really staying focused on the breaths.
We'll give them a few minutes.
Well, they could. That's a homework assignment.
It's a point well taken because, and as one of my teachers would often describe the practice, he would say it's simple but not easy, because our minds haven't been trained. However, by doing the practice, we gain a growing stability in mindfulness and awareness. And so the breath is one way of practicing mindfulness of the body. The other is simply mindfulness of body postures. When we're sitting, we know we're sitting. When we're standing, we know we're standing. When we're lying down, we know we're lying down. So it's very simple, very grounded in our ordinary experience, but it's with a quality of attentiveness rather than having the mind just be lost in mental proliferation. And that's why mindfulness of the body is so effective and grounding and a really good place to start. Another aspect of mindfulness of the body is being aware of the different body sensations that we feel, of pressure, of tightness, of tension, of tingling, of vibration, heat, cold. The whole range of physical sensations can become the object of meditation. And it's very accessible to us.
And it means that what you're not doing is thinking about the past or thinking about the future, which is what we naturally spend almost all our time doing if we're not engaged in some task.
Exactly. I mean, and that's one of the very illuminating things about meditation practice is we get a very good first-hand look at what our minds are doing, which mostly has gone unnoticed for so long. And so we give the mind these very simple exercises and then see, as you said, how difficult it is to stay simple, to stay connected. However, the other foundations of mindfulness then also open up the possibility of being mindful of the mental activity. So we become aware, for example, just of our mind states. Is our mind bored? Is it restless? Is it concentrated? Is it interested? Is it agitated? Right. And so all of that becomes a part of the mindfulness practice. We incorporate mindfulness of the mind.
And there's a particular emphasis on this in Vipassana meditation, right?
Very much so.
Compared to other traditions.
I think it's probably included in other traditions as well, but it's very explicit in this particular discourse of the Buddha. To be mindful of the condition, one might say, or the state of mind that's present. Because it's quite interesting. I'll just give you a simple example of this, and one that's quite fascinating to me. With emotions, we usually become aware that we're feeling them pretty quickly because they're like a strong event in our experience. We become happy, we become sad, we become angry. So usually we know that this is happening. It may take some practice to be actually mindful of them, but they're not hidden from us. On a more subtle level, this mindfulness of the mind would include being aware, being mindful of background moods. Sometimes you can just go through a day with a certain mood, and it becomes like a filter through which we're seeing the world. It might be an uplifting mood or it might be a depressing mood, but because it's so amorphous, we generally are not mindful of it as another arising state. It just becomes the colored glasses that we're wearing. So this is a more subtle aspect of mindfulness of the mind, to open to what's the mood in the mind now.
Okay.
And I just find it very interesting because it can't be pinpointed, and yet we're aware that they're there. Okay. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
Okay. Now, we talked about how these practices can make you appreciate the impermanence of things. And impermanence is, of course, a big theme in Buddhism. Another big theme, and one that people have more trouble wrapping their minds around, is the idea of not self, anatta, or anatman. What can you say, well, maybe first by way of describing what that is supposed to mean, but I'm also curious as to how meditative practice, in your view, can help that make sense to you. Yes. An idea that doesn't naturally make sense to people, to say that there's a sense in which the self doesn't exist, that just doesn't normally make sense to people. But
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, so many parts of the Buddhist teaching do resonate with our common sense.
Mm-hmm.
This particular aspect of the teaching doesn't.
Right.
And so it really requires a further exploration. So I'll give you an example of which might help explicate what it means. So we take the example of a rainbow. You know, after a summer storm, the sun might come out and we see a rainbow in the sky. Mm-hmm. And generally, we feel happy at seeing the rainbow. It's a beautiful object of sight. But the question is there a thing in itself which is the rainbow? When we look more carefully, we see that what we're calling a rainbow is the coming together of certain conditions of light and moisture and air. And when these conditions come together in a certain way, there's an appearance of a rainbow. But there's no thing in itself which is the rainbow other than the appearance arising out of these conditions. So self is like a rainbow. There is an appearance of Bob, of Joseph, of each one of us. There's an appearance which comes together, which appears because of the conditions of all our mental, physical phenomena, coming together in a certain pattern. And we recognize the pattern, we call it Bob, Joseph, rainbow. And on a relative level, we are experiencing it. When we see a rainbow, we are responding to something. So on a relative level, we can say rainbow exists, but on a more ultimate level, we see that there's no essential substratum which is rainbow.
There's no essence.
Right. And so one Tibetan teacher really expressed this beautifully. Somebody asked him, is the self real? And he said, yes, the self is real, but not really real. And that captures these two levels. It is real on the relative level, and we interact on this level, and it's the level of our conventional reality. So we're not dismissing that. Mm-hmm. But we just see that on a deeper level, there's another whole way of perceiving things.
Okay.
So let me give you one more example.
Sure.
So I'm going to hold, I don't know if you can see me holding up a cup here.
Yep.
Okay, so on one level, the cup, it feels like it's something solid, and we use it, and we drink water out of it, and we can describe it. If we looked at this cup through a high-power microscope, or if we could perceive the cup on the subatomic particle level, there would be no cup. The reality of the cup would be completely gone, and we'd be experiencing things on a completely different level. And yet, at the same time, the cup is here. Mm-hmm. So it's not that this relative level of cup and the more ultimate level of, we could say, insubstantiality or selflessness, it's not that they're two different things. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing perceived on different levels.
Okay.
The value of this is the more we perceive the more ultimate level, then we live on the relative conventional level of our lives with less attachment and with more ease, because we understand that there's no ultimate existence to it, even though on a relative level there is.
Okay, let me press.
So I hope that made some sense.
I as you know, I've thought about this. And I've actually, by way of full disclosure, I've gone to meditation retreats at the Insight Meditation Society, which you founded. So I've certainly tried to grapple with some of this stuff. But let me still give you some of the kind of pushback I would think you might get.
Yes.
Okay, so rainbow, it's true. You look at a rainbow from the outside, and it looks like a rainbow. On closer inspection, it's a little more complicated. It's not a thing per se in a fundamental sense. But with the self, there's a difference. I mean, it's true that I look at Joseph from the outside, and on closer inspection, maybe the bounds of his being are permeable, and there's energy coming in and energy coming out and all that. But there's also that with the self, with a human being, unlike with a rainbow, from the inside, a given person, unlike a given rainbow, presumably, has this sense of self ordinarily. And so how in meditation is the internal perception different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that really goes to the heart of the matter.
Okay.
Because we can talk about it theoretically, but the question is, how do we experience this? And what's the transformation that happens when we experience it?
Right.
So in meditation, the way we begin to actually experience or get a sense or a taste of the selfless nature of things very often is through the doorway of impermanence. That is, we see things with greater and greater refinement as arising and passing in each moment, even consciousness. There are certain levels of meditation where we can experience consciousness itself arising and passing each moment. So this is a powerful opening, because then we're seeing that even when we may know thoughts are changing and emotions are changing, the body's changing, we still may have the sense, well, I'm the one who's knowing it all. And so the self then resides in consciousness. But at that point in practice where we see consciousness itself arising and passing away, that's like pulling the rug out from the sense of self. And we see that what we're calling self, and it's a useful designation. I'm not suggesting
Sure.
we get rid of it, because on the relative level, it's really helpful. But as we see this arising and passing of consciousness itself, then we just surrender to the process.
But if we see it, don't we have to be conscious at that moment? I mean,
Yes, but that consciousness itself is arising and passing, and it's experienced as arising and passing. So there's no corner at that particular place in meditation practice. There's no hideout corner. The very observing mind is itself arising and passing in each moment.
So do you mean you have a sense of distance from your consciousness itself?
I wouldn't so much say use the term distance as non-identification with. There's the experience of consciousness and every object of thoughts, emotions, sensations. So there's the experience without being identified with them.
Okay.
And that's when we begin to get a sense of the selfless nature.
Okay. And you refer in your book to, I don't know how you put it, but the idea of thoughts without a thinker. And,
exactly.
and the observing of that. Now, I think a lot of people are going to ask, wait a second, what's that like? When I have a thought, I think I'm the one thinking it.
Okay,
so tell us, what does it feel like, Joseph, to have a different vantage point on your own thoughts?
Yeah, this is a terrific discussion, because it really is getting right to the heart of what meditation practice is about. So just a few examples. Mostly, both when we're sitting in meditation, but in our lives, we are generally unaware when thoughts arise in the mind. And so the thoughts come in and they slide in. They're very slippery. They slide in, and it's as if we hop on these trains of association, and we don't know we're on the train. We don't know we've hopped on. We don't know we're on the train. We don't even know where the train is going. And then somewhere down tracks, we realize, oh, I've been thinking. It's as if we wake up from being lost in a thought. So in that whole process, there is a very strong sense of self-thinking. Okay, I'm the one. What happens as the mindfulness gets stronger and we begin to be aware of thought as they arise, rather than after they're already over, when we see thought as it's appearing in the mind, then it becomes much more both obvious and accessible to be experiencing the thought in a way no different than hearing a sound. It's just another object appearing and disappearing in the mind. And so the thought comes and goes, and we begin to get a sense of the impersonality of thoughts. So one little exercise to do is It's a kind of fun exercise. Especially if you're sitting in a group, just to play a little bit and to imagine that every thought that's arising in your mind is coming from the person next to you. And just notice if that would make a difference in how you're relating to the thought. Mm-hmm. And it can give you a sense that the identification with thought is extra. Okay. The thought itself is appearing, disappearing like a sound, but being identified with it is something we're adding.
Okay, so then in meditation there can be the sense that thoughts are just kind of coming out of nowhere, so to speak, almost like voices, although it's not like you're hearing things maybe literally, but it's more like...
Correct. It's just an appearance in the mind. It's words in the mind appearing, and there are causes behind it. You know, it could be old memories that are coming up. It could be fragments of conversation. So there are causes behind it, mm-hmm. but none of the causes belong to us either. Mm-hmm. We're not. It's all causes and conditions, you know, mm-hmm. creating what's arising, and it's very interesting and very freeing to be able to see thought in this way, not to be imprisoned mm-hmm. by our thoughts. One of the most interesting exercises to do in meditation with respect to thoughts, when the mind is thinking, to ask the question, what is a thought? Not what the thought is saying, mm-hmm. so not the content, but just as a phenomenon. You know, it's like taking an interest in this phenomenon of thought. And so as the thought is there, to hold that question, okay, well, what is the nature of thought? Mm-hmm. And in that moment, we can see so clearly how insubstantial they are. Mm-hmm. It's like a little energy bubble. It's very ephemeral. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to notice is that when we're unaware of thoughts, they have tremendous power in our lives. Mm-hmm. They're like dictators in the mind, you know, where our thoughts are saying, go here, go there, do this, do that. Our whole lives, we're just following the dictates.
And we normally think that that's okay because we're the ones doing the thinking and we have our interests at heart and so on.
Yeah, but that's true. But very often, as we know, a lot of the thoughts are giving pretty poor advice.
Yeah, we learn in retrospect, yes.
Right. But the difference between the power that thoughts have when we're unaware of them and how little power they have when we're aware that we're thinking, that contrast is quite striking.
Okay, so then let me see if I have this right. During meditation, you can begin to see that or come to believe that. Whereas you might have thought all your life you're thinking thoughts. The thing you think of you as is thinking the thoughts. It's closer to being the case that the thoughts try to capture you, the thing you think of as you. Right? I mean, they come from somewhere, right. Somewhere in your body, somewhere in your brain. But yes. But whatever part of your body or brain you're thinking of as you is more like the captive of the thoughts. The thoughts reach out and try to grab it and carry it with them.
Well, I think that's kind of an interesting way to describe it, and it certainly feels like that. But I would phrase it a little differently. It's just that the thoughts are arising, mm-hmm. and there is a strong habit of mind to be identified with them. So it's not so much that I think they have the intent to reach out and capture us. Yeah. But rather there's just this very strongly conditioned, habitual identification. This is how we've lived our lives. Mm-hmm. And it takes a practice to break that conditioning. You know, to be mindful of the thought rather than to be lost in it.
Okay.
But it's tremendously freeing.
But let me just put it this way. Thoughts become to seem much more like active things than the things, than passive things. In other words, they're actors in your consciousness that you've got to deal with, and you're in the habit of going along with them, but that's not necessary.
Correct. And they become a lot less active when we see them for what they are, when we're not pulled into the drama of them. You know, it's sort of like going to the movies. We go to the movies and there's a very absorbing story and we're pulled into the story and we feel so many emotions and, you know, we're excited or afraid or in love, whatever. And then maybe in a moment we sit back and see, oh, this is just light. These are just pixels of light projected on a screen, right? That everything that we thought is happening is not really happening. It's the same way with our thoughts. We get caught up in the story, in the mind drama of them, forgetting their essentially insubstantial nature. So when we have that basis of wisdom about the nature of thought, then we have more power to choose, okay, which thoughts are helpful, which are going to serve me, serve others, then we act on them. Which thoughts are not so helpful. Those we can more easily let go.
Okay. So we've said you don't really have to identify with your thoughts, even if you're in the habit of it. We earlier said you don't really have to identify with your emotions, even if you're in the habit of it. And this is, you know, you can kind of see how, if you start looking at all aspects of subjective experience like this, you could be led to doubt the very existence of self. And this is the logic, to some extent, of the Buddha's argument for the non-existence of self, right? As framed in the context of what are called the five aggregates.
Yes.
The way Buddhist thought divides your experience into these five aggregates, some of which we've talked about.
Yes.
That's the logic of the argument, right? There's nothing in your experience that you are really intrinsically identified with. Exactly.
Let me give you one more example of kind of the selfless beside the rainbow and what we've just been talking about. This is an example I've been giving for 40 years now, so it's one of it's one of my favorites. You know, so you go out at night, and if it's a clear night and the stars are out, you recognize, most people can recognize the constellation, the Big Dipper. You know, it's a pretty obvious constellation in the sky. Okay, so the question then is there really a Big Dipper up there? You know, and of course we realize there's no Big Dipper. Big Dipper is a concept which we're overlaying on a certain pattern of stars. There's no Big Dipper. But what's interesting, so self is like Big Dipper. Right? The notion of self is a concept, just like Big Dipper is a concept. And we're overlaying that concept of self onto this pattern of mental, physical, emotional content. So we're putting a name, we're giving a designation. Oh, Joseph, Bob, Big Dipper. But what's interesting is that even though we know Big Dipper is a concept, and there's no Big Dipper in the sky, to go out at night, look up at the sky and see if it's possible not to see the Big Dipper. Very difficult, because we've been so conditioned to see in a certain way. Now, it's helpful to realize that the concept Big Dipper can be useful, just like the concept of self can be useful. So even though it's a concept, one of the stars of the Big Dipper actually points to the North Star. So if you're out in the middle of the ocean and you want to navigate, you know, you need to find north. So the concept can be helpful. We're not suggesting either Big Dipper or self, we get rid of the concept, but to understand that that's what it is, rather than it having some intrinsic reality.
Right.
When we see that Big Dipper is a concept, even though we use it, what happens is then when we look up at the sky, we see the sky undivided. You know, it's possible to see all the stars as part of a unity. So imagine what it would be like if we could experience the whole world not bound or limited by the concept of self. Using it, and we need to use it to operate on the relative level, but if we have a deeper wisdom that it is just a concept, then so many aspects of our separateness falls away.
Right, and this is a different side of not self than we've been talking about. We've been talking about the not self as doubting the kind of, in a sense, internal cohesion of what you normally think of as this self. But there is this other side of it, which you're now alluding to, which is doubting the firmness of the walls you see dividing yourself from other selves, right?
Yes. And this plays out on so many different levels, both on some grand cosmic level of non-separation, but also on very ordinary ways we separate. So, for example, there was the 16th century Zen master named Bankai, and he wrote, there's a book of his teachings called The Unborn, which is a wonderful book. There's one line in that book which just jumped out at me as having tremendous practical significance. He said, "Don't side with yourself." And I was thinking of how many interactions and conversations and relationships, in which we're engaged in, and we have that attitude or perspective of siding with ourselves, and how freeing it can be not to side with ourselves and actually to see things from another person's point of view. Mm-hmm. It just opens up the nature of relationship and dialogue and conversation.
And do you sometimes have the experience in meditation of the bounds dissolving or being more permeable? And if so, what's that like? How do you get there?
Well, there is that. There are many experiences in meditation, and no single one of them is the goal, because the goal is really freeing the mind from grasping. But in the process, we have many, many unusual experiences. One of them is, as the concentration and mindfulness gets stronger, we begin to experience the body not as something solid, but rather as a fluid energy field. So the boundaries can really dissolve. The experience at those times, the boundaries are very dissolved, but it's not in it can be in a very peaceful way.
And can that entail, like, say, hearing a bird song or something, and thinking, well, that's no less a part of me than the signals I'm getting from what is within what is normally called my body.
That's exactly right. I mean, in that quality of openness, and the sound arises of a bird, for example, there are times in meditation where we don't know, we don't make the distinction of inside and outside. Mm-hmm. It's just a sound being known. Mm-hmm. And so that boundary very much can dissolve at times. But also people don't need to be afraid that somehow they're not going to be able to navigate in the world, because as soon as we get up from the sitting, we come back to kind of our ordinary perception, and
right.
So there's no problem in this, and it's actually quite freeing.
Right. And here, I think we're getting, I think, at the intersection of not self as a metaphysical doctrine and selflessness as an ethical ideal.
Yeah, and it's the latter which is most important, because the metaphysics is all interesting, from a philosophic point of view, but the Buddhist teaching is really about the pragmatism of freeing the mind and the heart from conditions which cause suffering. Mm-hmm. And so it's always very pragmatic. People can argue or debate the metaphysics, and have been for thousands of years, but it's really about are we clinging, are we attached in a way that's causing us suffering? Mm-hmm. And can we let go?
And I gather there is this, I mean, here's kind of the question, I guess. Does the idea of selflessness in the metaphysical sense, beginning to doubt the solidness of the bounds between you and other beings, does that naturally translate into a more generous disposition toward the other beings who now seem less separate?
Yeah, it definitely does. And as one teacher expressed it, no self, no problem. and that gets manifest if we're not holding on so tightly to a notion of self, then the natural consequence of that is more open-heartedness, more generosity, more compassion. Again, one teacher expressed, and this is a really beautiful teaching, that compassion is the activity of emptiness. And emptiness here meaning emptiness of self. So in that openness, the natural activity of that state is compassionate response. So it's a beautiful opening.
Okay. You mentioned emptiness. We're kind of out of time, but I'm tempted to go there. When you apply the doctrine of not self to kind of everything in your field of perception, the rainbow and everything, and say to yourself, or become convinced of this through meditation, none of these things have an essence. That's sometimes referred to as the idea of emptiness, as a perception, right?
Yes.
As a perception about the world. Wait a second, everything's empty. I don't know if you've had a strong perception of that through meditation. If so, and you want to describe it, and also talk about the potential danger of carrying that in the wrong direction, feel free, because you mentioned you do get into this a little in the book.
Yeah, and then now we're really getting to some
deep stuff.
Yeah, some deep stuff.
You don't have to go there if you.
No, well, I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
But keep in mind that this is a very brief comments on a big subject. It's interesting that the word emptiness, the reason it's in a way problematic is because in English, the word doesn't suggest something so appealing.
No.
It's empty and vacuous and blank, and so people aren't automatically drawn to this notion of emptiness as being something desirable. So it's helpful to understand first that it's the English translation of a Pali and Sanskrit word, shunyata, and in Buddhism it has a very specific meaning, and it means emptiness of intrinsic existences or emptiness of self. So, for example, when we understand that constellation of stars is empty of Big Dipper, it doesn't mean that the stars disappear.
Right.
It just means we're no longer creating a concept which solidifies them. And so the emptiness is really letting go of the concepts which cover just how things actually are. When we understand the Big Dipper as a concept, nothing changes in the sky. Everything is as it always was. We're just understanding it in a new way. And so it's the same thing as we talk of emptiness of self. Nothing changes in our mind and body. It's the same sensations, same thoughts, same emotions, same processes going on, but they're understood from a totally different perspective. And it's a perspective which gives greater ease. Now, the danger, you asked about the cautionary aspect of this. Sometimes people either think about emptiness or get just a little glimpse of it and then get attached to the notion, oh, everything's empty. And then it becomes very dismissive of the relative conventional reality. Oh, this isn't important, it's empty. I don't have to do this, it's empty. With that kind of attachment, then there's no spiritual development, because everything is up-leveled, but it's intellectual. Up-leveled to, oh, it's all empty, it doesn't matter, it's not important. And one of the great Buddhist adepts, Nagarjuna, he was talking about the difficulty of being attached to the solidity and relative truth of things. But he said far worse than that is attachment to the notion of emptiness. Because if people get attached to the notion, to the concept, then they have no place from which to progress.
Right. And it leads to a kind of nihilism, or can.
Exactly. And so it's a very deep understanding that we have to actualize an experience, not.
Okay. Well, I wish we had more time, but we've already exceeded the normal limit. I would like to ask you one more question in closing. Just how are you different? How is your life different as a result of the fact that you have done regular meditative practice?
Yeah, I've been practicing for quite a long time now. I got first interested when I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand, and that's more than 40 years ago. So I've been doing it a long time. And when I look back over all these years, I see there's been a tremendous increase in easefulness of being because of greater acceptance of just whatever is arising. I don't get so upset by the different things that are arising in my mind. By investigating some of the unwholesome patterns that have been there, I've been able over time to really let a lot of them go. For example, and this is a common one for many people, just the judging mind, the critical mind, the mind that has a comment about everyone and everything. So people report this a lot in their practice, and I've seen this a lot in my own mind. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, one sees both how ridiculous that is as kind of a waste of mental energy, and have learned to really let them come and go in the moment until they start coming a lot less. Mm-hmm. So the mind becomes much less judgmental, both of others and even more importantly, of oneself. So there's a much greater sense of openness, of ease, of connectedness, and insight, of just insight into impermanence, insight into selflessness. So it really is a path of greater happiness as we practice.
Okay, natural quick follow-up. Does that render you, and I'm sure you've heard this, does that render you incapable of making moral judgments?
Oh, not at all, because the very essence of the Buddhist teachings is wise discernment, of seeing what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. Mm-hmm. And actions based, motivated by greed and by hatred, delusion. The Buddha said these are unwholesome motivations. Mm-hmm. Those motivated by generosity, by love, by wisdom, these are wholesome. And there's a lot of emphasis on discerning the difference and seeing in one's own mind the difference.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's a critical dimension.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, I want to show people what the Kindle version of the book looks like. And actually, the physical version looks remarkably like that, I'm sure. That is the cover of the book. It does cover the waterfront. So it really serves as a kind of proportional representation of Buddhist thought. I would say, although the focus is on cultivating mindfulness and that really basic Buddhist text on the subject, which you will again perhaps do the service of pronouncing correctly for me.
The Satipatthana Sutta.
Exactly the way I would have said it, Joseph. Okay, well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
And I hope you come back and talk again sometime.
Great, thank you.
Okay, take care.